Hello, this is Hilary Robertson with episode 28 of Harmonious World. I started renumbering the episodes from season 3 and it just didn't work. So what was episode 1 of season 3 is actually episode 27. So I apologise if you've already listened to it and thought it was episode 1. I got really confused and I didn't want to confuse myself further. I'm very excited this week to be joined by Luna Pearl Woolf, whose album Fire and Flood has been nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Classical Compendium. It's a very interesting piece of very modern, very 21st century classical music, but the cello especially is beautiful. Matt Heimovitz is the cellist on the album and it's absolutely beautiful. Fire and Flood is a collection of pieces, including a deeply stirring mass, a couple of Leonard Cohen compositions too. One of the most beautiful pieces is the cello choir concerto Après moi le déluge, which was inspired by Hurricane Katrina. Fire and Flood features To the Fire for choir, and that's the choir of Trinity Wall Street on this album. And then it also features the Après moi le déluge for solo cello and choir. And then Everybody Knows by Leonard Cohen, and Missa in Fines Orbis Terrae, 1 to 1 to 1, and then the amazing Who by Fire, Leonard Cohen, which is for 3 female voices and cello. I really enjoyed my conversation with Luna, and I hope you do too. Hello.
There, how are you?
I'm great, thank you, Luna. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Thank you for joining me. It's a real honor. I'm so impressed with this album. It's amazing.
Thank you.
I mean,
It's here.
the Grammy nomination in itself is enough proof that it's, well respected. But
I have to say the Grammy nomination was so shocking to me. It was so out of the blue. I completely wrote this album off from the sense of like any kind of wide popular response. So it's really amazing for me.
Yeah, it's not an easy listen, is it?
Well, no, it's not really. Yeah, it's not really meant to be in the sense that it's intense stuff. It's intense subject matters, and yeah.
It's incredible, and unfortunately now we were expecting to have the Grammys in some form at the end of the month, and of course it's now going to be the middle of March instead.
I know. So. I was like, they weren't going to put us on the big show anyway. Couldn't they just let us know?
Yeah.
It'll be fun to wait. All the more suspense. I like suspense.
Yes, absolutely. So tell me how Fire and Flood came about. And how long has it taken you to get these recordings together and the compositions together?
This album it's interesting. At first it just had it came about with the idea of music for voices and instruments, because I'm writing in my professional life a lot of opera now, which is big projects that hardly ever can be recorded easily. But at the same time, I had all these smaller works that I felt had an equal kind of drama to them that involved solo voices or choruses. And that was the initial idea. And when we were looking at the various pieces that fit that bill, like Après moi le déluge, like 1 to 1 to 1, I brought out this piece that I hadn't looked at for decades, that I started in 1994, or I finished in 1994. I must have started it sometime before. And I revised it for this album. So in fact, it's really a kind of a retrospective of my works for voices over these 25 years.
Right, and obviously there's the 2 cover versions as well, the Leonard Cohen pieces.
Right. Those were initially inspired, in fact, by a UK group. There's a vocal trio called Voice that was touring with Matt Heimovitz for a couple of seasons. And I wrote these arrangements with them in mind, but it didn't quite fit them. They weren't particularly enthusiastic about these arrangements, and I still thought they had something in them, and I really wanted to explore what that could be. And I think the voices that we chose for the album really, highlights what those arrangements want to be.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because you're quite unusual in a good way in having this, especially the cello and voices, and especially the one to one to one, which is three female voices, three cellos and three basses. That's just joyous. The textures of that is just beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was so much fun to write, and actually a real challenge in some ways. But the concept of writing it for the three cellos, three basses, and three voices was that idea sort of started off the whole piece. So then from there I had to build what would that make sense? What would really bring that out in the best possible way? And finding the text was difficult. But then I had so much fun with that orchestra of sounds and the way that they can interplay and go in and out of all the different ranges and still give you that real sort of sensuous bass.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Can talk me through your background, where you came from, how this all how you've ended up here, because your influences must be very, I guess in some ways I want to say non-American.
Now I want to ask you where that comes from.
I don't know. It just doesn't feel like, it's certainly not the American songbook or the American, you know what I mean? It doesn't feel like folk and that kind of American influence. So talk me through where you think this came from.
God, that's such an interesting question. When I was a teenager, I was playing clarinet in the orchestra and I was singing in the choir. But even before that, I was hanging out with my dad, improvising songs at the piano and percussion, and thinking of music as this very joyful kind of thing that fills the room with family and also I think there are influences that go, even though I'm not a particularly religious person, the Jewish tradition has these beautiful musical elements that really guide the way we feel in the ceremonies. And so even if I was only going as a kid twice, three times a year, I still sort of absorbed this very melodic, very singerly way of worshiping together. And I do sometimes now hear those kinds of sounds in my music more than I might have expected. So going back to sort of when I decided that I wanted to be a composer, that came more out of the vocal tradition than out of the instrumental tradition. Even though I just loved chamber music, I think my favorite musical experience in the clarinet was playing a Mio trio that had a bit of jazz in it. And chamber music is such a revelation when you're a young player, because the first thing you do is, just try to slog through, and then, you're in a big band or something. But when you get to play your own part and you're interacting individually with other people, those experiences are what make you feel like being a musician has a way of an individual expression that could mean something. But definitely the combination of text and words is where I really felt that I wanted to speak as a musician, as a composer. So you asked how I got from there to here, and I've never tried to assess that question because, it's a circuitous route to understanding your own inclinations. So looking back, I can see that the first piece that I wrote in a real composition class when I was in high school, but they sent me over to Amherst College to take the seminar with Louis Spratlin, who's a wonderful composer, friend of mine too now. And I was, a 16-year-old in a class full of 20-year-olds. And the first thing I did was a setting of, it was a song setting, but not, like you say, not in the American songbook sense or even in a leader sense so much.
No.
It's more like a storytelling idea. And that has really been prevalent through my whole trajectory. Even when I'm writing instrumental music, I'm trying to tell a story. And I'm trying to get the characters, get the instruments to represent characters, to transform their emotional trajectory through the course of the piece. And now that I'm working with opera, which I feel is so sort of ingrained in me, even though I'm not sure where that comes from exactly. I look back and I recognize that sometimes when I've had challenging experiences in instrumental pieces with the performers who didn't know what I was talking about or resistant to the musical ideas, it had to do with this, with the idea of performers in general as storytellers, and that a lot of times instrumentalists aren't seeing themselves in that role. They see themselves more in an absolute music role.
And also, I think musicians maybe, especially when there are voices, musicians tend to be the support underneath, and the voices are the ones that tell the story, whereas that doesn't feel like the case with yours, that the instruments are, as you say, it almost feels as if they're taking on characters within the whole.
Right, and that feeling has always been very strong in the way I see music. Um, and so over the years, I think I worked toward that in my own sort of blind way until I discovered opera and really started doing it in a more kind of like, this is, celebrating that idea that this is what I really came here to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Great stuff. I really wanted to talk to you, especially about, because it feels like at the heart there are, for me, there are two pieces that are at the heart of this album. The first is the Caterina one. Oh yeah, Après moi le déluge. That feels to me like that's kind of at the heart of this. Which I believe is kind of your response to the Caterina hurricane disaster.
It was a piece that I wrote just immediately after that, after the hurricane and its aftermath. And I was in this funny situation. I actually had this commission to write a work for cello and choir, and I had a completely different text by the same poet, Eleanor Wilner. But then, we were all captivated by what happened in the news, and I remember lying on my couch thinking, I can't write this. This is not the piece I want to write. And I called up Eleanor, and I said, "What do we do? This thing is so powerful. What we're watching and what we're experiencing as a world and as a nation." This is actually, I was living in Montreal at the time, but I had just moved there like months earlier, so I really still felt very much as though I was living in the States. And she agreed with me that we just put aside the previous idea, the entire concept of the previous piece, and she wrote these incredible words for me just in, like, I don't know, a week or two. And I set to work on the piece, and I had already conceived for myself I had given myself a toolkit or a paint box of ideas, of textures, of relationships between the cello and the choir that I wanted to work with. And so they were just sort of ready to pour out of me. And I had a really passionate response to what happened at Hurricane Katrina. And now that we're where we are right now, January 8th, is it?
Yeah.
21. And we've just witnessed what happened at the Capitol building in the US 2 days ago. It's actually kind of hard to remember what it felt like in 2005 to see our government fail the people of Louisiana, especially the lower Ninth Ward, to ignore the suffering of Black people, to think nothing of crushing an entire cultural iconic place where jazz came from, where blues came from. To watch that happen was felt like a blow to the gut, because there was this thing called the American dream, which the world really believed in up until that moment. And you felt the air go out of that when we were watching what happened after Hurricane Katrina. And those feelings, the disappointment, the idea of this dream being turned on its head, were what instigated those feelings. But then the piece, I wanted it to celebrate what New Orleans had brought to us as musicians, and the joy of that, and to know that that's not, it hadn't been killed. Even if the American dream was damaged beyond repair, there was what New Orleans had given us.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, and that it was going to take more than the floods to destroy that, to wipe it out entirely. Although obviously the devastation has been terrible.
On a human level, absolutely. And that's the crazy, now that we're so many years past this, you see that we never recovered from that, and it's gone downhill from there to what happened the day before yesterday.
Yeah.
And what happens now is equally scary, and we can only, I guess, hope. And now I live in Canada. I'm still a US citizen, but I feel like a rat leaving the ship,
Right. Well, it's
terrible.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? Because obviously, I hope over here in the UK, we've just had Brexit. So we're the first country to leave the European Union. And there are lots of us, I mean, I'm definitely one of them, who I still feel as European, as part of Europe, as part of the global humankind, as I did before. And all it seems that it's brought, that Brexit has brought, and that a lot of the stuff that's going on in America has brought, is division and sort of pointless economic trials and difficulties and all of that sort of thing.
I kept wondering over the whole Brexit period whether, like, why not just reverse it?
Yeah.
Why just keep going with this charade? And that's in a way what we've been doing with Trump is especially the Republican Party was just like, okay, it's just a charade, but we can keep it up until we get elected again.
Yeah.
And the consequences are dire.
They really are. And the I don't know if you saw the video that he put out that was kind of trying to be apologetic.
The first one, like on Wednesday?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Just awful.
I love you one.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. Yeah. It's just.
I was listening to it like live when it happened, and I could not believe it. And then afterward, the news people were like, "Okay, so that happened."
Yeah. It is ridiculous. It looks as if he's finally going to acknowledge that he is no longer going to be president in 2 weeks' time, but he's not going to go to the inauguration apparently. So it's like a child throwing his toys out of the pram, literally. So Après moi le déluge is a very interesting piece because it's not only talking about something devastating, but there is also this sense of cohesion. I love the Lord, I'm Going Down in Louisiana, that final movement. It's just beautiful. And the cello and the voices all joining together, that it feels like there's some sense that we're all in this together.
Certainly that last movement was, I was trying to celebrate something that I think, the culture in New Orleans is unique to the US, and the way music is embedded in all parts of life, and irony even is embedded. For example, the funeral march, they march with a band to commemorate a funeral. That doesn't happen anywhere else in the US. I think it does happen in some places in Africa and maybe other places, but I actually wrote that last segment up to the end in that vein. I wanted it to feel as though we had a tuba and a snare drum and a big brass section, and that the cello was soloing over that, and that we were basically seeing out that era with, an appropriately celebratory funeral march.
Yes.
So to celebrate that music and the people, and to not give up hope for a more beautiful future.
Yeah. Well, let's hope so. So talk to me about the two Leonard Cohen tracks, Who by Fire and Everybody Knows.
It's interesting when I look at those. So Leonard Cohen has been a big influence on me ever since I moved to Canada. I don't think I had even thought about him before then, but living in Montreal, I immediately started to read Canadian authors and listen to Canadian musicians, or recognize the ones I already knew that were Canadian instead. But Leonard Cohen's music really touches me partly because of what I was saying about text and music, he manages to make a profound musical statement out of very layered and evocative text and exceedingly simple musical settings, like
Yeah.
ridiculously simple.
Yeah.
um, and he has married the two in such a way that the music doesn't feel simple. It feels like it's revealing something about yourself while you're listening to it. And so when I chose these two works, it was because these two songs, Who by Fire and Everybody Knows, I felt like I wanted to take those musical ideas and the text and just sort of write a version of it that almost was what I already was hearing in my head when he's singing it. Kind of like a kaleidoscope of what, you hear what he's doing and it's blowing your mind. And I just wanted to write the music that was the blowing of that mind. Does that make sense?
No, it does. Yeah.
I don't even think I've changed. I don't feel like I changed what he was trying to do. I mean, that's very, I can't say, of course, but yeah, that's what was my feeling, was that these pieces, this is like my musical language's version of what I'm hearing when I hear his originals.
Right. And that's why I think they're interesting, because they're so much more than cover versions. I always have an issue with people taking songs and trying to make it sound the same, but them singing it, which is what quite a lot of especially sort of artists early on in their careers, that's what they tend to do, is they try to replicate the original, but with them singing it. And there's not anything different. Whereas this is exactly not that at all. This, but as you say, it's almost like the response to the listener's musical response to those songs.
Yeah, I think there's something about, and I've had to analyze this in retrospect to figure out what I was doing.
Yeah.
Then there's another way in which, when I look at the whole album and why I chose those particular songs, or why I chose all the texts in the album and how I responded to them, it's very socially critical. It's trying to highlight the ways in which he was already, talking to us about our own hypocrisy and getting us to realize the irony of our own actions and our feelings and our relationships. And those elements are in all the other pieces on the album too. And I didn't quite realize that till after I looked at it as a whole. But they fit so very well. And when we were looking at the order of songs in the album, that's something that we thought about too. Yeah, so I put Everybody Knows after Après moi le déluge.
Yeah.
Is very much a statement like, you could have prevented this. We all saw the ship sinking, George Bush.
Yes. Yes.
And so there is the sense that I'm in a dialogue sort of in a similar dialogue in a different era that Leonard Cohen was when he wrote those songs.
Yeah. And it is, I think that's why the Grammy nomination makes sense, because it is a collection that sits well together. It's almost as if you can't imagine these pieces in a different order or a different setting. They work so well as telling that story somehow.
That's amazing to hear. I think one of the things that shocked me when I looked back at the piece that I had written when I was not even 20 was how much it, especially seeing as a couple of days ago, it almost describes exactly what happened in Washington 2 days ago.
Yeah.
Enough. But that I was already trying to express the individual and collective psychology and of trauma and straining against something larger than oneself. And the response that I had from the people who were around me at that time was like, "You're kind of crazy. No one will ever perform this. What are you doing?" And it turns out that 20 years later, that's what I was doing, and I've been doing it the whole time.
Right.
But everything does have its season, and people are more willing to embrace this idea of storytelling and of artists having a political stance or a social voice, which certainly in the 90s was not, especially for classical musicians, was not really a thing. And yeah, so it fits so well, and it really surprised me when I looked back and realized that.
Yes. I interviewed Maria Schneider for this podcast, and her Data Lords album, which was obviously in the summer, it was, ages ago, but that's another album which is saying so much about the world we live in and how we are responding to that world, and how we need to wake up, really. And I get the same sense. For obviously it's very different music, and you're very different people, but nevertheless it feels like women composers in 2020, 2021 are being listened to, and their music is being listened to, and their music is being appreciated, and it's okay to be more than just a composer, and to actually have an opinion that goes behind that music.
I think that's absolutely right. And it is interesting to think, you've said it so interestingly. It makes such perfect sense to say that if you have a stance and you're expressing that stance, that is your voice. Yeah. But back when we were in school, those of us of my particularly advanced age, you were told that what is your voice has to be devoid of your identity. That somehow, especially because I was so much in the minority as a female composer. When I was a student, I was one of 14 freshmen at Oberlin as a composition major, and all the rest were boys. So the idea of your identity having something to do with your music had almost like a taboo attached to it. And partly because you felt at the time that you had to fit in, you had to struggle against your individualness, your uniqueness within this world, because if you would bubble yourself too much or something if you but there's an element of that is also about age, right?
You get to an age where you can go, actually, you take me as I am, or you don't take me at all, and that's fine.
Absolutely. And it's very hard for a 16, 17, 18-year-old to feel that way. And the ones that do, it's always like, wow, cool.
Yeah.
But I certainly was much more self-conscious and conscious of I was gonna say my place in the world, but I don't think I had any real conception of my place, quote unquote, in the world. My conception of it was, much more narrow than its potential could have been. And all of these contextualized problems or contextualized interpretations that had that influence on me when I think about it.
Yeah, but this is a stunning album, Luna. I really enjoyed it. When it first came through, I was like, well, what's this about? And then I started listening to it, and I did what I quite often do with stuff that I get sent, is I listen to, the first track, and then I'll dot through and just listen to bits.
What we used to call drop.
Yeah. But then I had to go back and listen to it all in order, because I wanted it to make sense. And I love it. It's a great album.
Thank you so much.
That's okay. Thank you. So thank you. Just quickly before we finish, can you just talk me through what has lockdown been like for you, and what have you seen as the positives, perhaps, that have come out of it? Because we all know what the negatives are.
Yeah, that's a good point. We do all know what the negatives are. So I am fortunate to be living in Canada. As Canada goes, I'm living in the worst place, which is Quebec. Montreal, Quebec has been the most hard hit of all the cities.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we had one of these fluky things where the spring break for kids here in Quebec is 1 week earlier than it is in the rest of Canada. So just before March, I guess it was the week before, so like March 7 to 13 or whatever, was the spring break. And so lots of Quebecers went down to, no, I think it was more like March 1 to 10 or whatever that is. They went down to Florida, they went to New York, they went all over the world, and they came back
Ah,
and they carried with them the disease. So I mean, it wasn't not even remotely like New York or anything like that, but it became serious here fast, and they were able to control it with people here just are a little bit more willing to listen to reason. There are masks worn on the street. If it's a busy street, people will wear their masks. If they're in the park alone, they'll take them off. If they go in the grocery store, they'll put them on. Recently there's been a much more strict. Gone back to like counting the number of people in the stores, and they are imposing starting Saturday a curfew here, which is the first time we've had a curfew, and that's a little bit scary.
yeah,
But amid all of this, my children still go to school.
right.
So they have procedures in the school to minimize interaction with the students. Have only interaction within their own class. They're wearing masks all day above the age of 9-ish, 10-ish. And we've gotten a few reports of cases within the schools, but not very many. So they know the value that having the kids in school brings. And so we've had that. Whereas my friends in the States, they haven't had school since March, and
Yeah.
so many kids are suffering, so many kids without the resources to, we have in our house computers and iPads lying around because we read music off of them. And, we were able to just like redistribute all the technology so that our kids had everything that they needed. And that is not the case for most
No,
people.
no,
Not to
no.
mention just internet. And, we also had to upgrade our internet connectivity and whatever. Sorry, I'm going way off topic, but it just pains me so much that the priorities have been so wrong in the States. So yes, here it's been hard, it's been lonely, but the kids are doing well. The stores are totally stocked. There are parks. It's a nice life for an introvert, man. I mean, I swear, it's almost the same as my ideal life. I wish I could see some friends and invite a person over now and then, but I was never into parties. And, so this, for me, this has not been, too tragic.
No, no.
And from the positive, you asked about the positives. So I have actually written a lot of music this year. I was able to take on a project that I never would have done normally. A friend of mine who runs a children's music program, one of these things that completely unpaid and just for the sweet love of it, was incidental music to a play that they wrote about global warming and like sort of
Oh, wow.
kids activated. And I loved this playwright, and she was taking input from the kids. They would have these playwriting sessions together with these kids. They wrote a play, I wrote the music, they did a whole thing on Zoom. That was kind of the beginning of the year. And I've been able to work on a new opera called The Limit of the Sun with Andrea Stolowitz, my librettist partner. I wrote a solo cello piece for Matt Heimwitz for his new Primavera project, which he's recording right this minute. And in fact, as soon as I get off with you, I'm going to get on Zoom with them. He's recording it in Texas, of all places,
Oh, wow.
Marfa, Texas. And yeah, so it's been productive in that way. Creative collaborations on Zoom are relatively easy if you're not actually trying to play the music. So we're
Yeah.
talking about texts and talking about dramaturgy. I've also been coaching some pairs of composer librettist teams that that won a prize here. Sorry. In Canada, there's a new prize for female composer libretto teams, and with one exception, really, the teams are relatively inexperienced in both collaboration and opera. They're interested in storytelling and good composers, good writers, but to get them to mesh together and to bring the piece to the point where it can be written and can be workshopped, I've been kind of their coach through that, and that has been a lovely experience. I've really enjoyed all the very surprising and rewarding
Yeah.
elements of trying to articulate what I see and what they're trying to pull out, and trying to help them bring their best to each of the stages. It's challenging and it's really fun.
Yeah, sounds it. Sounds
Yeah.
excellent. Very good. Well, Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I appreciate your interest, and I'm so glad that you love the album. That really makes me very, very happy.
Oh yeah, no, it's amazing. It's really good, and it's one of those ones that I'm just going to keep listening to. So it's not just a one-off. And I really hope that there's good news at the Grammys in March.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Great to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Luna. Bye.
My pleasure. Bye.
Sometimes it seems strange to me that I've taken on this podcast and I get to talk to these amazing creative musicians. It was such fun talking to Luna about Fire and Flood, and I hope you get a chance to listen to it. One of the things I'm planning to do as I develop the Harmonious World podcast will be to include some tracks, some clips from the music, but I've just got to find my way around the copyright issue, because what I don't want people to take the music from my podcast and use it elsewhere. So we'll have to work that one out. But meanwhile, I do want to thank you, those people who have fed back to me about how they've enjoyed listening to these conversations. It's a real pleasure to know that people actually are listening and that I'm not just doing this for myself, even though it is an absolute pleasure to do these conversations. So please do subscribe to the podcast, and then they automatically will pop into your inbox. Leave me a review if you can. There's also a new little icon, which is Buy Me a Coffee. If you'd like to make a small contribution, because obviously there are some costs involved in having this podcast, and it would be lovely to have some supporters. But more importantly, please do let me know what you're enjoying. And I have some great people lined up, some very, very interesting musicians lined up for forthcoming interviews, and I hope you enjoy those. So meanwhile, I hope 2021 is being kind to you. Please stay well, stay safe, wherever in the world you are, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook, and it's a great delight to bring this series of discussions with musicians and composers and writers and all sorts of people to you. Obviously, there's no point in having a podcast if people aren't listening, and I'm very grateful to my listeners for doing so. Thanks also to Joe English for composing and performing this new theme tune. So wherever you get your podcast, you can leave a review. You can share this with your friends and family, either as a link or on social media and that sort of thing. I'd be really grateful for that. Don't forget that you can subscribe now. There's a link wherever you get your podcasts. So have a great week, and please remember why I started this, which is just to try and make the world a little more harmonious. Thanks for listening to Harmonious World.